Well, Russian opposition activist Vladimir Kara-Murza has been sentenced to 25 years in jail for charges linked to his criticism of the war in Ukraine. The journalist and politician has survived 2 poisonings allegedly by Russian authorities. Last year, CBC News Network spoke to Kara-Murza right before and after Russia invaded Ukraine. He was asked if he had any concerns for his safety at the time.
We have hundreds of political prisoners in this country today. So yes, I guess safety is not a notion that we associate with being in opposition here in Russia. But you know what? It is our country too, not just Putin's. We care about the future of our country. We want our country to have a better future than to be controlled by this corrupt authoritarian kleptocracy that we see today. And we know there are many, many Russians around this country who share our view, and for their sake, we have to continue our work. So many of my fellow countrymen, so many of my compatriots here in Russia share the feelings of shame, of pain, of indignation at this illegitimate, senseless, and brutal war, needless to say, an illegal war that Vladimir Putin's regime has launched against Ukraine. This is not Russia's war. This is not our war. This is yet another adventure launched by the deranged and bloodthirsty Kremlin dictator. Let's make that thing clear.
So now for more on this, I want to bring in Bill Browder in Washington. He is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. He's also CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and author of Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you.
Mr. Browder, how are you reacting to the news that your friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, has been sentenced to 25 years in prison, the maximum sought by the prosecutors?
It's, to be honest, it's a personal tragedy. It's a body blow. It's something which I knew was coming, but now that it's here, it's really hard to process. Vladimir is a very close friend of mine. We've worked together for more than a decade, traveling the world, trying to impose sanctions on Vladimir Putin for human rights violations. And now Vladimir is one of the people who's a victim of these human rights violations. And it really is just horrifying to think what he's facing, what he has faced in the last year in custody, and what he'll face in the future.
When we're talking about that 25-year sentence, it is the longest sentence that an opposition figure in Russia has received so far since the war in Ukraine began. So I wonder, to your point, why you believe this penalty, this sentence might be so harsh.
Well, I think there's 2 reasons. One is revenge on Vladimir Kara-Murza. Putin has been angry with him since the Magnitsky Act was passed because Vladimir Kara-Murza has played such a vital role in getting the legislation passed, which imposes sanctions on the Putin regime. They tried to kill him twice. They poisoned him in 2015 and 2017 for his work on the Magnitsky Act, and so this is personal revenge. But there's also another very important thing that Putin is trying to do here, which is to send a message to anybody else who's thinking about standing up to Putin, protesting the war, pushing for sanctions. And the message is, look, if you do that, you'll go to jail for the rest of your life, and you'll probably die in jail. That's the message that he wants to send to everybody, to shut everybody up. And it probably will work. I mean, you have to be an absolute hero to say anything in Russia if this is what they do to the dissidents.
For those viewers of ours who might be tuning in right now who are perhaps unfamiliar with Vladimir Kara-Murza's background, can you describe for us, and you've outlined it there in your previous response, just why he would be seen as such a huge threat to Putin?
Well, so Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian citizen. He's also British. He went to Cambridge University in the UK. He's a journalist by training who became an opposition politician. He was the protege of Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in February 2015. And Vladimir, for the last decade, has taken it on himself to travel to parliaments around the world together with me to testify in front of those parliaments, including the Canadian Parliament and many others, about why the Putin regime is criminal, why they're kleptocrats, why they're human rights violators, and how they need to be sanctioned, how their assets need to be frozen, and how their visas need to be canceled. And he's such an effective communicator. He's so charismatic and he's so persuasive that he convinced many countries to do this. There are 35 countries that have the Magnitsky Act around the world right now. in no small part because of Vladimir Kara-Murza. And Vladimir Putin was very, very angry about that. And he made it clear through these poisonings that they did to Vladimir in 2015 and 2017, and made it even more clear with this 25-year sentence, which, as you said at the start, is the longest sentence of any political prisoner in Russia. It's longer than the sentence you would get for terrorism in Russia, longer than the sentence you get for rape that resulted in death in Russia. This is like, truly unbelievable what they've done to Vladimir to make a point.
Now, in our conversation, you, of course, mentioned, and we've heard this from Vladimir, too, that this is also not a surprise in terms of the detention, perhaps maybe not the longest sentence, but a strict, harsh penalty here. When looking back to your statements, April 2022, you tweeted out, in fact, that you begged Vladimir not to go to Moscow. And he insisted, saying that as a Russian opposition politician, how could he ask Russians to stand up to Putin if he was afraid to return himself? So I want to take you back to that moment a year ago and how you were feeling then and how you're feeling now about that statement that you made.
Well, I mean, it's something that is almost impossible for me and almost anyone else to comprehend, which is that he kind of knew, the risks. He knew that he could die or he could lose his freedom, but he was ready to sacrifice those things for his country. And it's just hard for any of us to understand that kind of bravery, that kind of integrity, that people like that exist in the world, that someone like Vladimir is ready to take those risks for his own country. And whatever happens to him, and I pray that he survives this, but he is a hero of the Russian people for what he's doing right now and for standing up and for being brave. And in his last statement before the court, he says he doesn't regret anything. He doesn't regret any of his statements because they're all true, and he's never going to be intimidated by these people. And this is the stuff of legend. This is like Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, Martin Luther King. This is the kind of person that Vladimir Kara-Murza is.
We've heard human rights organizations and Western governments denounce the verdict and demanded his release. And we know that also you had flown to Washington in order to perhaps see some action. What would you like to accomplish, and what would be your message also to the Canadian government?
Well, I'm here in Washington right now. I'm meeting with the most senior senators and members of the House of Representatives on Capitol Hill. I'm here very specifically because in the United States, there's a special designation they have under U.S. law. It's called wrongfully detained status. And if he gets that status, then the entire resources of the U.S. government will be put in place to try to free him. And I think he needs to be free in order to save his life. We're doing something similar in Canada. In Canada, there's a resolution going through Parliament right now, which is calling for him to be declared an honorary Canadian citizen. And once that happens, then we want to get the Canadian government to also do the same thing that we want the U.S. government to do. In fact, all governments, all Western governments should work together on freeing Vladimir Kara-Murza, because I believe he won't survive 3 years, let alone 25 years, because of all the damage they did to him with the poisonings that he's now experiencing in prison.
Well, this is an important story to cover, so we very much appreciate your time today. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Bill Browder is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. We reached him today in Washington.